When choosing Peru and Lebanon, we made the decision based on a theory that countries were fairly similar in scope and would provide an interesting comparative landscape. What we will show throughout this presentation is that perception is a powerful thing, and diving into the macroeconomic data and risk indicators of the countries showed us that one country was more stable than we would have thought, and another was in far worse state than we knew. Today, we'll use both quantitative and qualitative data to paint a picture of risk for exporters and investors in both Peru and Lebanon while drawing our own conclusions. Over the last 8 years, real GDP growth has remained positive with fluctuations between 2.2 and 6%. Unemployment, which we will look into in subsequent slides, is very stable, only fluctuating between 5.9 and 6.9% in the same period. In addition to the macroeconomic data provided, there is some additional macroeconomic context we'd like to provide. Peru's inflation rate is extremely stable at an average of 2.6%, largely due to a very strong independent central bank established in the early 1990s. Strong monetary policy, along with strong financial institutions, have put Peru on track to have the strongest post-COVID recovery of any country in the region. GDP and unemployment, however, are vastly underreported. Roughly 60% of the population is engaged in the informal economy. This tells us that goods and services produced and sold both informally and illicitly are not included in the economic picture of the country.
Thank you, Jordan. Now, looking into Lebanon, at first glance, we see that while there are some strength in the macroeconomic numbers, there are some troubling figures, particularly the decline of the GDP, the negative account balance, and the high external debt. Diving deeper to make better sense of the numbers, we see that Lebanon shows improvement in inflation with a decrease of 3% from 2018 to 2019. However, recent articles speak to the hyperinflation rate of 56% that Lebanon is currently experiencing due to the economic crisis that sparkled in late 2019. Lebanon's steep decline in growth, as shown by the real GDP, illustrates how the economy plunged into a financial crisis, mainly led by the sudden stop of capital inflows. The government defaulted on March of this year, making this the first ever sovereign default in Lebanon.
Thanks, Nati. Now we're going to take a minute just to look at some social political indicators across both Peru and Lebanon. We'll reference these a bit later in the presentation. Governance indicators. Looking at Peru, we see higher regulatory quality and accountability. However, a declining control of corruption in the country.
Similar to Peru, corruption in Lebanon is troubling, and this is likely driven by the power that the elite class has over politics. These governance indicators also show a high political instability and violence in Lebanon.
Moving on to the political system, in Peru, we see that although they've struggled with factionalism since the 1940s, each period of transition has given way to higher periods of stability. The most recent transition period, of course, giving rise to the highest level and longest level of stability in the country.
Similar to Peru, Lebanon has also struggled with factionalism, mainly due to the strong polarization of rival political groups with high religious influences. The black dotted line that you see in the graph represents the Lebanese Civil War.
Taking a different tack, we're going to look at the International Property Rights Index. Peru ranks highly in the ability to register property and in patent protection, but with average scores in property protection. This aligns with FDI-focused programs that Brooke and I will delve into a bit further.
Well, as expected, Lebanon has a low rate in political stability, but its lowest rate is in patents, even when they have a patent law that protects inventions and plant varieties. And looking at doing business, as you can see in the next two slides here, it's a lot easier to do business in Peru than in Lebanon.
Thanks, Nati. Now we're going to delve a little bit further into the different risk factors. So starting with sovereign risks and looking at Peru. So what lowers the risk in this country? Peru is a country with a strong external position and a perception of the ability to pay, so low sovereign risk overall. We've identified a number of factors here. So access to natural resources. Peru is strong in mineral, energy, agricultural, and fishery exports, and also a large exporter of ores. This position as an exporter means makes it better able to attract FDI. Additionally, foreign investment is freely permitted in Peru, and the government practices non-discrimination. So foreign investors have the same rights over their investment as nationals.
Switching back to Lebanon, what may seem like strengths from prior indicators, such as high reserves, we know has recently changed since the country defaulted in March of this year. So moving into weaknesses, we see that Lebanon defaulted on 1.2 billion euro bonds in March of this year, and this is the first time that this happens in this country. Their economic collapse came about in October of 2019 with a debt of about 170% of GDP, which is one of the highest in the world. Historically, there has also been a high dependency on aid from Gulf states, but the rise of Islamist political parties has deteriorated Lebanon's ties with these states and compromised its FDI since 2016.
Thank you, Dory.
On the other hand, looking at Peru, it's in a much stronger position. So the COVID crisis has brought about some doubt and potential issues in terms of sovereign risk. Pre-COVID, China accounted for about 30% of Peru's export value, or about 6% of its GDP, which does create a little bit more risk for the country if it's losing its largest export and import partner. Additionally, there's a lack of human capital. So Peru typically ranks near the bottom of the OECD program for international student assessment. While it's improved somewhat in recent years, it's really just not competitive. This is a deterrent to FDI, specifically if firms are concerned about their ability to attract, maintain, and grow top talent.
Thanks, Jordan. Okay, moving into political violence risk. It's a wonder that despite Peru's incredibly weak political institutions, its financial institutions have remained relatively unaffected. Peru's monetary policies have provided a shield that enabled Peru to weather some pretty big economic and political storms, which we'll dive into after we hear from Dory.
Yeah, in the contrary, it is unfortunate to say that there aren't many strengths on the political front for Lebanon. A step in the right direction to fight corruption specifically was establishing a government of technocrats earlier this year. However, Lebanon currently has a high political violence risk. Moving into weaknesses, which explains why, we see that there is a long history of unrest in the country. In short, a civil war, followed by the assassination of their prime minister in 2005. Afterwards, the Lebanese have conducted several elections, but the last two prime ministers have stepped down. First, in October of last year, due to protests calling for the overhaul of the entire political system, and most recently in August of this year, due to protests related to the Beirut explosion. This political instability further aggravates the country's ability to secure financial aid and align on an economic reform plan, which is so desperately needed right now. The situation is so dire that it is predicted that 40 to 50% of the population will reach poverty level.
Thank you, Dory. Yeah, I mean, Peru's political institutions are also very weak and appear to be getting worse, or at least more seen. Some recent examples: President Vizcarra was voted out of his office just this evening. He also dissolved Congress back in September 2019. And all of this happens in the huge wake of Operation Car Wash, which is an ongoing criminal case that implicates 4 prior Peruvian presidents and hundreds more officials and corporate executives in corruption. So moving into transfer, exchange, and convertibility risk, I would say that the Peruvian Central Bank took 2 major decisions in the early 2000s: inflation targeting and foreign exchange reserves accumulation, with the aim to build enough public confidence and strengthen the Peruvian sol to pursue a gradual de-dollarization of credit over 2 decades with great success. As a result, the Peruvian sol is one of the strongest currencies in the region today. They offer a legal stability agreement as well to foreign investors, which guarantees no exchange controls and no governmental regulation on the acquisition of foreign currency or money remittance abroad.
Looking into the strengths for Lebanon, it was hard to find one. The Lebanese pound was pegged to the dollar in 1997, and until 2019, it was pegged. So for 23 years, the exchange rate remained steady, and this gave the people of Lebanon a stable purchasing power and a relatively high standard of living. But this has changed. Since the economic crisis, due to the debt levels mentioned by Dory, and also the corruption and economic mismanagement, only in the past year, the Lebanese pound has depreciated more than 300%. And this has given an opportunity for the current black market to emerge. So in March of this year, Lebanon's financial sector imposed capital controls, preventing more Lebanese from transferring any money overseas or withdrawing dollars from their bank accounts. despite the fact that 75% of accounts in Lebanese banks are denominated in dollars.
Thanks, Nati. Moving to Peru, despite Peru's progress in de-dollarization, companies still pay 58% of their input costs in dollars as of 2016, which reflects business owners' reluctance to fully put their confidence in the domestic currency. And I'm just going to go ahead and lead us into the next risk, which is confiscation, expropriation, and nationalization. So Peru's risk is in alignment with the world average, which is 3. The investment agreements that Peru enters into actually include clauses around expropriation, such as non-discrimination and fair prompt compensation, as you see here. But I'll explain the weaknesses after we hear from Nati.
So going into the strengths about expropriation in Lebanon is rare. The expropriation law states that compensation for expropriation is independently determined and based on the fair value of the market, and also it must be for public purposes, and there shouldn't be any discrimination to foreign company or investors. Looking into foreign investment, it's also encouraged in Lebanon. It allows the establishment of joint stock operations, limited liability, and offshore and holding companies. And in case of commercial disputes, domestic and foreign investors have access to local courts and to commercial arbitration. So looking into the weaknesses, the investment law has limitations, like the standards of treatment and the protection applying to domestic and foreign investors. And other restrictions are that in order to have bank insurance and organized fraud, the majority of the board has to be Lebanese. Also, legal services are reserved only for Lebanese nationals.
Wow, thanks, Nati. So, the weaknesses in Peru, it's that your ideas of fair market value might differ from Peru's ideas of fair market value. Take the 2017 case of Bear Creek Mining Corporation versus Republic of Peru. This Canadian mining company's right to operate was suddenly revoked after the company had secured all correct permits in public interest. Bear Creek requested $224 million in compensation, which included projected profits, but the Federal Tribunal of Peru only awarded them the sunk investment costs of $18.2 million, which was the alleged more straightforward way of evaluation.
Thanks, Brooke, Nati, and Dory. Moving on to just a quick summary of what we've discussed today. There's no doubt that social and political tensions exist within Peru. Large amounts of inequality, vulnerability to natural disasters, a large informal economy, and political tensions within the current government are just some of the contributing factors. That said, strong financial institutions, an independent central bank, and strong fiscal and monetary policy have kept Peru at stable levels of unemployment and inflation while allowing the economy to continue to grow.
In contrast, and in summary, as we have covered, Lebanon is high risk, mainly driven by an economic crisis, political violence risk, and sovereign risk. This has all been aggravated by COVID-19 and the explosion in the port of Beirut.
So what does that mean in numbers? When we're looking at country risk to exporters specifically in Peru, we believe that the overall score is a 2 out of 7. While some risk is there, we believe that overall the country is stable and able to meet its obligations to exporters.
Yeah, and based on everything we have seen about Lebanon, we're giving a rate of 7 out of 7, due mainly to the political risk and the sovereign risk.
Thanks, Nati. Now looking at foreign direct investment, we believe that the overall risk in Peru is as well a 2 out of 7. While some of the risks may be slightly higher, overall Peru is a stable country that is fair and open to investment.
Yeah, and in the case for Lebanon, it's pretty similar. The only rate as it's going low is the confiscation and expropriation. We're giving a 5 out of 7. So in the overall risks, we have a 6 out of 7 for Lebanon.
Awesome, thanks, Nati. One last note that we want to make is the credit rating of the countries that we've been discussing today, overall credit worthiness. Looking at Peru, we see that they're rated fairly stable amongst the 3 major credit rating agencies. However, if you take a look at Lebanon, you'll see ratings in C, D, and RD, and these are all a sign of default across the board. Thank you so much. That's all we have for you today, and we'll look forward to your comments and questions in the forum.
Thanks, everyone.